Okay, let's just dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to unpack a super controversial but honestly really fascinating argument from a recent presentation. We're looking at one speaker's totally bold thesis that 5 of our most common, everyday climate terms are actually, in his words, destructive deceptions. Now, whether you absolutely agree with him or completely disagree, seeing how he deconstructs these accepted phrases gives us a really sharp look into the massive debate over global energy policy.
To keep things impartial, we're going to systematically follow his agenda. We'll start with the power of language, then rethink the concepts of crisis and pollution, look at the reality of the energy transition, compare clean versus dirty energy, and finally, weigh the actual energy trade-offs.
All right, Section 1, the power of language and how terminology actually shapes policy.
The speaker kicks things off with some real blunt intensity. He argues that credible, honest dialogue is pretty much completely missing from today's discourse. To him, mainstream climate language isn't just some harmless PR spin, it actively drives really harmful policies. He claims that using alarmist terms directly blocks life-critical infrastructure, think natural gas terminals and pipelines. And beyond the physical stuff, he says this language causes massive anxiety in younger generations, basically squelching their optimism, while at the exact same time deflecting our global attention away from highly solvable health problems that are literally taking millions of lives right now. Language, in his view, sets our global priorities, and he thinks our current priorities are totally backwards.
Okay, let's move right into Section 2, Rethinking Crisis and Pollution, where he deconstructs the first and third terms on his list.
First up on the chopping block, the term climate crisis. The speaker flat out rejects this framing. Now, to be clear, he does acknowledge the foundational data. He notes that, yes, the globe has been slowly warming and sea levels have been rising for about 150 years. But here is where his argument totally pivots. He points out that since the end of World War II, which is a period where fossil fuels pushed atmospheric CO2 up by about 50%, what else actually happened? Well, we simultaneously saw these explosive, unprecedented surges in global human life expectancy, overall wealth, and health. His main assertion here is that any negative impacts from climate change are just overwhelmingly dwarfed by the massive benefits humanity has gained from ramping up our energy consumption.
To really hammer home his pushback against the word crisis, he points to a massive decline in extreme weather deaths. Using IPCC reports, he notes that the actual frequency of events like hurricanes hasn't increased. But what's way more striking, the mortality rate has absolutely plummeted. We're talking going from nearly 500,000 lives lost annually back in the 1920s down to around 10,000 today. He argues this is a profound human success story that we should be celebrating, definitely not a crisis.
The next term he tackles is carbon pollution. He actually calls this the most shameful marketing term he's ever heard. He challenges this by drawing a super hard scientific line between a greenhouse gas and an actual pollutant. He reminds us of this crazy biological fact: if atmospheric CO2 ever dropped below 150 parts per million, plant life, and, consequently all of us, would literally starve. True pollutants, he argues, are substances that directly harm human health, things like lead, mercury, or particulate matter. And he makes sure to point out that thanks to sensible regulations like the 1970 Clean Air Act, those actual deadly pollutants have been slashed by 86% in wealthy countries.
But the really crucial point he makes here hinges on this staggering number, 3 million. And it's all about misdirected priorities. He argues that by hyper-focusing on CO2 as quote-unquote pollution, we are completely turning a blind eye to true deadly pollution. Citing World Health Organization data, he points out that 3 million people die needlessly every single year, mostly in lower-income countries, from indoor air pollution, and that's caused by burning wood and dung just for cooking and heating. The speaker argues that confusing CO2 with real pollution actively deflects resources away from this massive, totally solvable human tragedy.
Moving right along to Section 3, the energy transition reality. Here's where he deconstructs the second term. When you break down the global energy supply, the speaker points out a really stark reality. Despite literally trillions of dollars in global subsidies over the last 3 decades, the needle has barely budged. Think about it. 30 years ago, fossil fuels provided energy in the mid-80% range. Today, they're in the low 80s. Meanwhile, wind and solar combined make up a mere 3% of the global primary energy supply. He stresses that this 3% was just the low-hanging fruit in the wealthy world's electricity sector. And even getting that required massive mandates, resulting in power that he says is more expensive and less reliable. Which leads us to this massive, kind of counterintuitive number, 600 to 700 years. When you look at the raw mathematical reality of how incredibly slowly our reliance on fossil fuels has actually dropped, the speaker calculates something wild.
At this current glacial rate of change, it would take another 600 to 700 years to actually complete a full transition. Because the shift is moving at such a microscopic pace relative to global demand, which by the way hit all-time highs for oil, gas, and coal last year, he argues that using the word transition right now is just a deception. It implies this rapid change that the raw data simply proves isn't happening.
And the reason for this massive delay? He asserts it's not a lack of political will, but just undeniable physics. We're dealing with hard-to-replace hydrocarbon uses that currently just have no viable technological alternatives at scale. First up is heavy manufacturing. To fabricate basic, essential materials like steel and cement, you need incredibly high-temperature process heat, and today, that only comes from burning hydrocarbons. Second is transportation. Heavy-duty trucks, global shipping, aviation, they all require extremely high energy density to move massive amounts of weight over super long distances. Once again, he notes, today this is really only possible using hydrocarbons.
All right, that brings us to Section 4, clean versus dirty energy. This is where he deconstructs the final two terms on his list. To dismantle the whole idea of clean energy, he asks us to look at the sheer physical footprints of different power sources. When you compare them side by side for equivalent energy production, the speaker states that wind and solar require roughly 10 times the amount of energy-intensive materials, stuff like cement, steel, and polysilicon, compared to oil and gas. But even more staggering is the spatial requirement. Renewables require 100 times as much land. His point is that energy production is always a highly physical endeavor, and it's logically impossible to call something with a physical footprint 100 times larger clean or low environmental impact. Furthermore, he draws our attention to the global supply chains, the ones we often don't see, required to build this so-called clean infrastructure. The speaker points to severe environmental and human rights atrocities tied directly to the mining operations for renewable tech. He specifically cites the horrific conditions of copper and cobalt mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the alleged slave labor-staffed polysilicon facilities in Xinjiang, China, and the highly toxic processing ponds for rare earth metals, also in China. He argues that anyone calling these energy sources clean is either totally naive or just willfully ignoring the massive human and environmental toll right at the source.
He uses the construction of a single wind turbine to really illustrate his next point, which is that renewables are actually heavily dependent on fossil fuels just to exist. Let's walk through the steps. Step 1. You need massive amounts of coal and gas to create those huge steel-reinforced concrete bases. Step 2. You need intense amounts of natural gas to forge the giant steel towers. Step 3. You need high hydrocarbon process heat to fabricate the blades. Oh, and those plastic resin blades themselves? They are literally made out of hydrocarbons. Therefore, he asserts wind turbines and solar panels aren't replacements for fossil fuels at all, they are actually highly visible embodiments of hydrocarbons.
Let's wrap this up with Section 5, weighing the energy trade-offs.
If there's one core takeaway you should get from this explainer, it's the speaker's absolute insistence that when political posturing collides with physics, well, physics wins every single time. And the fundamental law of energy physics is pretty simple. All energy production brings trade-offs. There is absolutely no magic bullet here. Every single energy source has negative and positive impacts on the world. For instance, he notes that the massive energy density of oil and gas has actually allowed wealthy countries to return vast amounts of land to nature and forests, land that historically had to be chopped down for firewood or used for really inefficient farming.
So, when we strip away all the emotionally charged language, dropping terms like crisis, pollution, clean, and dirty, it totally forces us to look at the raw data and the physical reality of the world we live in. Since energy density allows humanity to thrive and actually return land to nature, but still heavily relies on hydrocarbons to function, we have to end our analysis today by asking you a deeply practical question. Based on the data and the physical realities of global supply chains and manufacturing, which package of trade-offs actually makes the most sense for our future?